Tell us a little bit about an outsider group that was involved in this whole situation called the White Women's Delegation.
Okay. What happened, as I mentioned, the case got pretty famous towards the end. Especially by 1950, it was a cause that if you were on the far left or in a progressive party like the Henry Wallace Party, which was a left of center offshoot of the Democratic Party that existed for a brief time in the late 40s and early 50s. If you were on that side of the political spectrum, by the summer of 1950, you were well aware of the Willie McGee case, and you were urged to write letters, and there were protests, and it became more and more of a cause. Now, what in the I believe it was but it was later. It was towards the end. It was the spring of 1951. Willie McGee was executed in May of that year, and so in those last few months, there was a lot of protest activity. And one of the more interesting episodes occurred with a group that, as you say, were called the White Women's Delegation. And the leader of it was a famous British writer named Jessica Mitford, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. She came from a prominent family in England. They were upper class, and there were several daughters. Some of them are still alive, and they took interesting positions. Jessica Mitford became a communist for several years in the 40s and 50s. Her sister Unity was a Nazi. Her other sister Diana was married to the main leader of the British fascist movement, Oswald Mosley. And there were a couple of other daughters, but they were the ones with the biggest divergence. So by the time she left England, came over to the U.S. and ended up married to a labor lawyer based in San Francisco. And she was the San Francisco or Oakland president of the chapter of this group called the Civil Rights Congress. And they were an arm of the Communist Party. They were their civil rights branch of the party. So she ran that thing. And they did local causes, you know, like police brutality or wrongful arrests, that sort of thing in the Bay Area. But a call went out in the spring of 1950 to people all over the country who were members of the Civil Rights Congress saying, you know, there was an execution date coming up in March of 1951, and there were lawyers wrangling for a stay, which they obtained. But with that coming to a head, officials of the Civil Rights Congress based in New York urged chapter members from all over the country to get themselves to Jackson, Mississippi for on-the-ground physical protests on behalf of Willie McGee. So Mitford, who was a very plucky kind of person, gathered up 3 women who were in the chapter, and they just got in a big car, and it's that Lucy Ricardo era, driving all the way from the Bay Area to Jackson on 2-lane roads. You know, it took them several days to get there. And what they did was they went door to door, getting doors slammed in their faces or having some good conversations, but they were trying to convince people, like, you need to sign our petition. You need to, you know, call your congressman to say that this execution needs to be stopped. So it was just basic street level protesting. It didn't really amount to much. Nothing was going to stop this except the U.S. Supreme Court, which they did for a while. But what was really funny about that story, on the way out of town after several days of fruitless canvassing, she said, well, you know, on our way back to California, let's go up to Oxford, Mississippi, because that's where William Faulkner lives. He had just won the Nobel Prize for Literature a few months earlier. And you know his famous house is called Roanoke. It's a big, stately, white, not a mansion, but a very nice house. They just walked up and cold called him and knocked on his door, and he had on his, you know, smoking jacket, and I think he had been drinking. So he invites them in and spends the next hour just declaiming how he's sure that Willie McGee is innocent, that he'd been framed. He knew all about the case. He'd been reading about it. And he said, I think this is a sham. So they said, thanks a lot. And they went out and typed a press release up and sent to newspapers instantly. So people raised hell about that down there. Faulkner would do that sometimes. He was not a civil rights activist, and in some ways his opinions would seem pretty retrograde today, but he knew that the system was wrong and that it had to be changed, and every now and then he would spout off like that, and it'd get him in trouble, and then he'd shut up again. But they got their scoop, you could say.
And you had mentioned some earlier, some kind of well-known figures in history. You just told the Faulkner story. There's another person who's in the book who was became a congresswoman after that, Bella Abzug.
Right, and what Bella's role was mainly in the appeals, but just to review again, there were 3 circuit court trials of this case. In the first trial, there was literally a mob atmosphere at the courthouse, so the Mississippi Supreme Court reversed the verdict, saying that there should have been a change of venue. The second trial, another defeat for the defense. They spent most of their time issuing a challenge about the race-based makeup of juries and grand juries in Mississippi, and they got a reversal on those grounds. And then there was a third trial where it was found guilty, and it made it past the Mississippi Supreme Court, and from 1948 through 1951, every legal action was at the federal appeals level. Now during those, starting with the second of the circuit court trials, the Civil Rights Congress up in New York hired young Bella Abzug, who was a recent graduate of Columbia, to run the defense, which didn't mean that she went down to the courthouse in Laurel and actually tried the case. That would have been, she said that would not have been possible. The way it worked, she was the architect of the legal strategy, and she and other people arranged for the lawyers who actually did the defense work in the courtroom. And in McGee's second and third trial, he had good representation from white male lawyers from Jackson, who are the closest counterparts that you see in a case like this to Atticus Finch. These were guys who grew up there and were still working there and had to take the consequences of defending somebody like this voluntarily, and the consequences were pretty heavy. So she was orchestrating that, telling them what to do, but not in the courtroom. Once it entered the appeals phase, her role became public, and she was the person often who had to go to Jackson to argue for a stay or something during the appeals process, and it was a tough role because it was dangerous, and there was nobody. The federal government wasn't doing anything to protect a lawyer like her in a case like this. So she had to go down there in July 1950 for a clemency hearing before the Mississippi Supreme Court, and she had trouble getting a hotel room. The federal government had no interest in civil rights causes of this kind. As I mentioned earlier, the only reason they kept track of this case, there's a ton of information in an FBI file. They were following it very closely behind the scenes, but only because the Communist Party was involved. They weren't at all interested in Willie McGee's civil rights or his rights in court. They were just monitoring everything because the party was involved and they were following them. So Bella saw the appeals through to the end, and she was in Jackson, Mississippi on the night of the execution. And in the book, there's a very touching scene about the last couple of days. She and another lawyer named John Coe made some dramatic first-person appeals to the governor, to President Truman. She personally wrote a huge clemency petition that Truman reviewed and wouldn't go near. He was one of the Democrats who wanted nothing to do with any of this because of the communist involvement. But her role was, that's a pioneering position to be in. She was one of the first graduates from the Columbia University Law School, and then to be in a situation like this where there's no roadmap for something like that. So, and there's a lot to admire there in what she went through.
I have one last question, then we're going to open it to you for questions and answers, so be thinking about your questions. We'll have a couple students who will come out in a minute with cordless mics. But Alex, you spent a lot of time in Mississippi, and it's been 60 years since the resolution of that case. How have race relations changed in Mississippi over that 60-year period?
Well, it's interesting. I was in junior high when desegregation of schools finally happened after 16 years of massive resistance. So obviously, many things like that have changed quite a bit. During the case, there were no fundamental rights, and the courts were totally unfair. But nothing's perfect anywhere, and that's true in Mississippi. What I witnessed as a student in 8th and 9th grade during the upheaval of segregation, and in Jackson, it was a major event. It wasn't a slow transition. It happened over the Christmas vacation. We got a little extra Christmas vacation because they were trying to get things sorted out. So first semester of 7th grade, schools were totally segregated. Second semester, I was one of, I think, 23 white kids left in a big junior high, which was suddenly African American. So the key thing is that almost everybody left the system, and they have never come back. There were periods where it looked like the majority of white people might revisit the public schools, and I'm talking about Jackson in particular, but it's true in most of those towns. They left for private schools or church schools, or they moved to counties that were majority white, so that they could have their kids could have a majority white school experience. So you don't have anything like the balance you see in a town like this, and I don't think it's ever going back.